Hello YouTube, Play-Doh Bear here, and today we're going to finally feature a Pyro build on this channel. This build will be the first of our community build series, and created by the one and only DEUCE Wiggly, dubbed the Mod Bomber. This build is very easy to use for all players and is a great introduction to the Pyro class, and will help you familiarize yourself with weapon rotations, skill usage, and the fact that you're so tanky, mistakes are meant to be made with this build. So without further ado, let's go and get started. Before we go ahead and go through our usual build breakdown, I want to highlight a few things that makes this build a little bit more unique than maybe some other builds you've run across. And that is, all, if not most of our damage is going to come strictly from our weapon mods being supplemented by the one and only reload boost, which is extremely broken, by the way. So what do I mean by this? Well, if we take a look at reload boost real quick, so when we activate Volcanic Rounds and then the skill ends by weapon swapping or reloading, we get a powerful 50% anomaly damage bonus granted for 15 seconds. So what does that mean, anomaly damage? Well, anomaly damage is the only type of damage that is also going to affect our weapon mods like Shadow Comet and Claymore Torrent, Moaning Winds, Radiation Splash, Clip Combustion, Kinetic Stomp, you name it, right? However, if we took a quick look here, you see that we're utilizing max health, status power, and cooldown reduction. So you may be wondering, well, why aren't we putting anomaly power as a base stat on this build? Well, like I mentioned earlier, since all of our damage is going to be supplemented by reload boosts anomaly damage bonus when the skill is on cooldown for Volcanic Rounds, anomaly power, unfortunately, does not benefit any sort of damage increase to skills like Shadow Comet, Claymore Torrent, Moaning Winds, Radiation Splash, so on and so forth. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and begin our full build breakdown. Starting with our primary weapon, we have none other than the Funeral Pyre, which is going to be required for this build to succeed, as we're going to be utilizing the mods Shadow Comet and Claymore Torrent. Now Shadow Comet and Claymore Torrent gets the most value out of the reload boost anomaly damage bonus with Volcanic Rounds, as the internal cooldown on Shadow Comet and Claymore Torrent is extremely low, which makes the fact that we can go ahead and swap to our secondary, and then swap right back to our Funeral Pyre and still blast, while the anomaly damage bonus is still active with reload boost being on cooldown with Volcanic Rounds. So great value here with Funeral Pyre, and I do not recommend any replacements for this primary weapon as it is required for this build to truly succeed. Moving on to our secondary, we are going to go ahead and use the Anemoi with Radiation Splash and Moaning Winds. This is a great 1-2 burst combo when going up against elites, bosses, and even any ads that are in a group that you may or may not have missed with Claymore Torrent and Shadow Comet. So it's great and versatile in any situation. Now, that being said, since we are using the Mod Bomber build, and since all of our damage is coming from weapon mods, go ahead and experiment with different weapon mods on the secondary, and you may find a combination that you like more than Moaning Winds and Radiation Splash. However, this is recommended by the homie DEUCE and myself as well, as it is that great 1-2 punch, but if you want to try something else, you can definitely experiment with other mod choices. That's going to be up to you. Moving on to our pistols, we're going to be using the Bolt and Thunder with String of Gauss and Ultimate Damage Link. More on why we're going to be using these two on our pistols when we get to the tips and tricks section, so don't miss out on that, as you'll see why Ultimate Damage Link is going to be very hot in this build, especially for boss fights. That being said, let's go ahead and move on to the rest of the build. The skills we're going to be utilizing for this build is going to be Ash Blast, Volcanic Rounds, and Thermal Bomb, and we'll get back to a bit more on the skills page in a moment. Going over our gear pieces, let's go ahead and focus on all the attributes that we're going to be prioritizing here in the form of max health, status power, and cooldown reduction. So we're going to go ahead and use max health simply for the fact that max health is going to be much more beneficial to us than anomaly power, because anomaly power in this build will be providing minimal usage. And I mean that because all of our damage is going to be coming from our weapon mods, and weapon mods are not affected by anomaly power. What does affect weapon mod damage, as I mentioned earlier, is the anomaly damage from reload boost, as well as vulnerable, damage to statuses, for example Ash and Burn in this build, as well as global buffs like Captain Hunter. Now, moving on to status power, this is also great for a build because of our low cooldown on our Ash Blast, because we're also prioritizing those cooldown reduction attributes, And Ash Blast being on such a low cooldown just means great crowd control for you and your entire team. And as you can see, we have Death Sentence as a mod for our headpiece, which we'll get to in just a moment, which is going to be providing great amounts of debuffs for you and your entire team. And like I mentioned earlier, cooldown reduction is great as well, just because of the fact that all our abilities are going to be up right away, so we can go ahead and keep cycling our Ash Blast, Volcanic Rounds, as well as our Thermal Bombs. Now, the mods we're using are Death Sentence and Ashen Boost. Death Sentence is a great debuff, and if you guys didn't know, now you do, Death Sentence also works for the entire team, not just for the Pyromancer. That's why it's such another great addition to Ash Blast, as it provides that great debuff for your entire team with weapon damage and anomaly damage against marked enemies, respectively 40 and 30% for 8 seconds. The second mod we're going to be utilizing on our headpiece is going to be Ashen Boost, as it is a great damage to our status, aka Ash in this case, providing a 20% damage increase to all enemies afflicted by Ash. And we'll see here as we move along with this build guide in the class tree as well, we have a good amount of synergy to damage with Ash. That being said, moving on to our chest piece, we're going to be using the Fire Frenzy mod and the Double Fun mod for our thermal bombs. Fire Frenzy, so we can have an additional trigger of thermal bomb, so we have 2 instead of 1, which is great for debuff scenarios. As you'll see in a moment, we also have branded in this build. And Double Fun, as now our thermal bomb can inflict 2 targets when we go ahead and apply that application, so more debuff for our damage is always great. And in a team scenario, more debuff is always great for your teammates as well, again when paired with branded. Now, going to our pants, we're going to go ahead and use Ash Grasp and Captain Hunter. Now, Ash Grasp is going to be our flex mod here. You can use other mods in replace to Ash Grasp, like let's say Lasting Fire, which is a thermal bomb mod as well as if you're feeling like you're still dying with this tanky build that utilizes that max health, you can also use something like Damage Absorber, which is going to be the recommended defensive mod, as it provides resistance and armor as well. I would not recommend Mitigation of Death as a defensive mod for this build, as it requires kills with aim down sights, which you're just not going to be doing with this build. P-Shield is a great alternative if you do not have Damage Absorber. My recommendation here is Ash Grasp, however, Damage Absorber is also a great choice, followed by Lasting Fire and Perseverance Shield as well. Captain Hunter, there's not much need to be said about Captain Hunter, as it's going to provide you that 25% damage against elites, and damage against elites is always recommended. And honestly, Captain Hunter is one of those mods that should be in every single build, whether it's Firepower, Anomaly, Hybrid, you name it. More damage against elites, you can never say no to that. Moving to our gloves, we're going to be using Ash Increase Range and Bullet Kindling. Now, Ash Increase Range, in my opinion, is exceptionally amazing. Not only is it going to be providing Ash to all the enemies around you, it's also going to be, in a team scenario, really beneficial to your teammates, as that increased range will also apply Death Sentence. So no matter where your teammate is on the map, you can rest assured that if you catch Ash Blast, whatever enemy they're facing, it's going to be Ash too, and they're going to be just doing shit tons of damage to them. Bullet Kindling is great for you personally, as you're going to be dealing 20% more damage against enemies afflicted with burn. So just like Ashen Boost, it's going to work on all burn targets, which is great for this build, as you're just going to be blasting with that 20% extra damage with Bullet Kindling. Moving to our boots, we're going to go ahead and have the staple, the cornerstone of this build, Reload Boost, with also branded, as I mentioned earlier, which is going to be any enemy affected by the skill, which is Thermal Bomb. They're going to receive 40% additional damage. So great debuffs all around for this build, not only for you, but for your teammates. And then, of course, Volcanic Rounds, Reload Boost, that 50% anomaly damage bonus for 15 seconds. That's going to be active when you go ahead and swap off of Volcanic Rounds via reloading or weapon swapping. Weapon swapping being the most optimal choice here. That being said, that's pretty much all the gear in general. Hope you guys understood why we're going the mods we're going, but let's go ahead and take a look at our skill tree so we can dive into a little bit more detail on how all of this comes together. Now, going to our skill tree, we're going to be utilizing Ash Blast, Volcanic Rounds, and Thermal Bombs. Now, for this build specifically, let's focus on Volcanic Rounds first, and then we'll get to Ash Blast and Thermal Bomb, as they don't require as much of an explanation because they're pretty darn straightforward. Now, for Volcanic Rounds, what we're using in this build with Volcanic Rounds is basically to just get value out of Reload Boost, right? And if we forgot what Reload Boost, here's a quick reminder. a powerful 50% anomaly damage bonus is granted after the skill ends for 15 seconds. So basically, you're going to have this 15-second window when you pop Volcanic Rounds and then you swap off of Volcanic Rounds to where your weapon mod damages are just going to skyrocket, right? Your Shadow Comet, Claymore Torrent, Moaning Winds, Radiation Splash, or any combination of weapon mod damage you want to use for 15 seconds, it's going to get that massive 50% anomaly damage boost. Now, look at our cooldown for Volcanic Rounds with this build. It is 12.3 seconds, and that bonus lasts for 15 seconds. So basically, anytime you see Volcanic Rounds back up from that cooldown cycle, pop it, spray a few enemies with it, swap back to your Moaning Winds and Radiation Splash on the Anemoi, pop it, get that anomaly damage bonus, swap back to your Funeral Pyre, shoot it, get that anomaly damage bonus, and you just rinse and repeat that cooldown cycle, and it's just so much fun. That being said, Ash Blast, we know why we love Ash Blast. It is a great AoE tool, it is a great defensive skill as well, and it is great for the death sentence application for your teammates. Why is Thermal Bomb good? Exactly for the same reasons as Ash Blast is good, minus the increased range that Ash Blast has. Basically, Thermal Bomb is going to apply burn, it's going to interrupt elites as well, so a great way to CC them as well. Like, let's say they're casting an annoying skill, pop a Thermal Bomb, boom, they're interrupted from any skill they were about to cast. And with branded double fun and also Ash Grasp, you're also getting a lot more synergies with Thermal Bomb, that debuff for your teammates, that Ash application when using Thermal Bomb, and as well as double fun, Thermal Bomb being applied to multiple targets as well from the initial target that you choose. It spreads out. So great synergy here with this build with Ash Blast, Volcanic Rounds, and Thermal Bomb. Moving forward to our class tree, let's go ahead and start with our class passive. And let's go ahead and take a look at what bonuses we get for just playing the Pyromancer class. And that is our additional 10% anomaly power boost for just playing Pyromancer, which, again, like I've mentioned before, anomaly power will do nothing for this specific build, as all of our damage is being supplemented with reload boost on our weapon mods. Now, our secondary, which is our healing mechanic passive, is actually really good for this build, as since we have a shit ton of max health, skills marked damage enemies for 15 seconds, killing a marked heals you for 20% of your max health. Every single pyro ability counts as the skill mark damage enemies for 15 seconds, right? So that's going to be your heat waves, your feed the flames, your thermal bombs, your overheat, your volcanic rounds, your ash blast, your phaser beam, your eruption. Doesn't matter what skill you use, it is going to count for the healing mechanic. Taking a look at the rest of the class tree here, let's go ahead and focus on why we heavily prioritize top tree, and then a little bit into the middle tree and bottom tree as well, starting with the first node, which is a required node that we have to take to progress through the top tree in general, and that's going to be Inferno Weapon. Now, Inferno Weapon and every other weapon damage bonus node you're going to see here in this top tree is going to be irrelevant to this build. And that is because weapon damage does not increase any mod damage with our Shadow Comet, Claymore Torrent, Moaning Winds, Radiation Splash, or anything like that. All it does is physically increase our weapon's damage that the shotgun does, not the mods on the shotgun or your weapon. It doesn't have to be a shotgun, right? Assault rifle, sniper rifle, whatever. So you may be wondering, well, why are we going to even prioritize the top tree if most of the nodes are going to be utilizing weapon damage? Well, one, the top tree has cooldowns that we're going to need for Ash Blast, as well as some damage to enemies afflicted with Ash, as well as the vulnerable node, as you'll see here in a moment. Moving on to the secondary node we're going to take, as I mentioned about cooldown, we're going to take Marble Orchard here for the cooldown on Ash. We have to take Mark of the Anomaly to increase our weapon damage, as it is a required node. Nothing we can do about that, but the next node we're going to be taking is Trial of the Ashes to get more damage on enemies afflicted with Ash by 10%. Again, we have to take a weapon damage node. However, the node afterwards, we're going to be taking Conflagration for increase in our resistance piercing, as Curse of the Pompeii is kind of pointless in this build, as we're already utilizing so much status power. An extra 15% status power has no value, just like weapon damage does. So that's why we're going to take Conflagration here. And again, we have to take Mark of the Anomaly for our weapon damage against 10% marked enemies to progress the node. And if you're wondering why we're going Inferno Weapon here instead of, let's say, increase our armor piercing by 10%, armor piercing is going to be just about as useless in this build as weapon damage, but since we already have a lot of weapon damage percentage synergies, we're just going to go ahead and take weapon damage here. So our shotgun's pellets at least do that minuscule amount more of weapon damage. And speaking of weapon damage, here we go again. We have to take weapon damage to progress the node, but Now that we've progressed the node here, we can finally take Ashes to Ashes, where every time Ash is afflicted on an enemy, vulnerable status is applied as well. And vulnerable in this game, guys, is fucking overpowered. The enemies themselves applying vulnerable to us and us applying vulnerable to enemies is always recommended. It's super good. And the fact that our Ash Blast cooldown is so low, we can go ahead and just spam Ash Blast and always have application of vulnerable on our enemies for more damage. And the vulnerable damage also applies to our weapon mods as well. So take that into account. That being said, we are forced to take Nimble as a Flame because to progress the node, decreasing our reload time by 20%. Not as useless as weapon damage, but just about as useless. But can come in clutch when you do accidentally run out of ammo on your Funeral Pyre, when you're using the Funeral Pyre to get your Shadow Comet and Claymore Torrents. However, a correct way to use Funeral Pyre and how to correctly use the bullets on the Funeral Pyre will be covered in our tips and tricks section in a little bit here as well. Moving forward, we're going to go ahead and take Hurt twice as long. It is a required node, but it is finally a good required node that we have to take to progress the skill tree. And that's basically we deal 10% more damage to elites, while the elites dealing 10% more damage to us, a trade-off that we'll always take. The last two nodes we're going to take on the top tree is Trial to Ashes, 15% more damage against enemies afflicted with Ash, and then more cooldown for our Ash Blast. Moving to the middle tree, we're going to take Magma Golem. So that max health is a required node, but also really great with this build as it is going to synergize with our healing mechanic. The fact that we're stacking so much max health means Magma Golem has a bit more value as well. We're mainly taking Magma Golem so we can get a warm up, so we can go ahead and reduce our Volcanic Rounds cooldown by 15%. Then we're taking Magma Golem again so we can progress to Wildfire, decreasing all of our cooldowns by 10%. And if we're wondering why we're going to the bottom tree here, surprise, surprise, we're taking Archmage as it is a required node. And again, Anomaly Power is completely useless in this build, but we're taking the required node here so we can get, what is it again? Cooldown reduction. That is right. Reduce cooldown reduction of our explosive skills by 15%. So the primary reason of going primarily top tree is basically for our cooldown reduction, the vulnerable application, and the Ash damage. Middle tree for Wildfire and our cooldown reduction for our Volcanic Rounds, and bottom tree for that cooldown reduction for our thermal bombs. So the synergistic between cooldown reduction and Ash increased damage as well as that vulnerable is why we choose this specific class tree, and it synergizes really well with always having our skills active, making sure we never run out of reload boosts damage window, as our Volcanic Rounds will always be up faster than the reload boost 15-second damage bonus of 50% anomaly damage. So that's why this skill tree is very, very, very ideal for this build. That being said, let's go ahead and move on to the pros and cons section of this build really, really quickly. Then we can go ahead and tackle that tips and tricks section. Let's go ahead and start off this section of pros and cons with the pros of this build. The first pro is that this build is extremely tanky for the fact that we have 48,000 HP, our healing mechanics, and that flex spot for a defensive mod if we so choose to. You will not be dying with this build whatsoever on any expedition that you go to. Yes, this includes Eye of the Storm as well. It is also a great crowd control build as well for our second pro, because we nearly have 100% uptime on Ash Freeze on the entire map. With our Ash Blast being on such a low cooldown, as well as all the status power that is stacked up on our gear, you're going to be hard pressed to find any other build that provides this much crowd control. For our third pro, we're going to be talking about a little bit of mob clearing that this has, with the combination of freezing enemies with Ash Blast, dropping Shadow Comet and Claymore Torrent, as well as clearing any additional mobs with Moaning Winds and Radiation Splash. For our fourth pro, we have huge single target damage because of our Thermal Bomb debuffs, our Volcanic Rounds anomaly damage bonus, and our Ash also applying vulnerable as well as death sentence and all the damage bonuses we get on Ash. Primarily, though, Thermal Bomb is going to be providing that massive single target bonus because of the branded mod that we're using for Thermal Bomb. And our last pro is that this is like a one build, kind of does it all, right? It fills the role of a debuff Pyro in a team, and it can debuff Yagic, it can debuff the guy that I can't remember the name in City of Nomads. What's his name? I'm going to butcher this. Hamza? Regardless, it's great in solos, it's great in duos, and it's great in trios. Moving forward to the cons of this build, I really couldn't think of many cons, and neither could DEUCE really. But there is one con that I do want to mention, and that is it's not as fast as the clear build as its alternate Ash Blast Overheat Pyro, right? We have that meta build with the Ash Blast Overheat Pyro that can literally clear an entire map, which this build will lack. However, all the pros makes up for the one con that this build does have. This build isn't focusing on that Ash Blast Overheat nuke. If you want that satisfaction, you can always go ahead and play the Ash Blast Overheat Pyro. But for a con, that's not so bad, as you don't really need to clear as fast as a nuke build, because remember, this is a great all-around build for the Pyro. It fills that role in solo, duos, and trios, and provides debuffs for your teammates. So as an all-arounder, it is amazing. Now that we're at our tips and tricks section of the video, the first tip is going to be probably the most important tip you can take away from this entire section, and that is to not spray your funeral pyre. I see a lot of new users playing this build when they run across a mob of enemies, just spray their funeral pyre like this. The reason we don't want to do this is because 1, it is depleting our ammo exceptionally fast, and 2, you have to once again remember that all of our damage in this build is coming from our weapon mods, right? So you also have to remember that Shadow Comet and Claymore Torrent have an internal cooldown of 2 seconds and 3 seconds. 3 seconds on Shadow Comet, 2 seconds on Claymore Torrent. So rather than spraying, we want to be tapping like this. Whether it's one tap, a double tap spray like this, or a triple tap spray like this, we want to be tapping our gun. And that is simply because when we're using a shotgun, which is the best way to take advantage of Shadow Comet and Claymore Torrent, or just multiple applications of mods, because of its bullet spread. So if you see, each one of these pellets, when they hit a group of enemies, is going to rain down its own Shadow Comet and Claymore Torrent per pellet hit per different enemy. So let's say, for example, we have a group of like 20 riflemen here, right? If we just spray it once, that one bullet spread is going to be enough to rain down Shadow Comet and Claymore Torrent enough to kill that entire mob. So also a good tip, I guess, to go along with this first tip here is to not ADS, as it's going to compact your bullet spread, but to always be hip firing when it comes to taking advantage of Shadow Comet and Claymore Torrent. For our second tips and tricks, we're going to be focusing on Ash Blast, and to basically use Ash Blast off of cooldown for general purposes, right? Because our Ash Blast has such low CDR, and with this increased Ash range, and with vulnerable being applied to enemy afflicted with Ash as well as death sentence, using Ash Blast on cooldown is going to ensure enemies stay frozen because of our massive status power on our gear, as well as providing that massive debuff for your teammates. Now, I do want you to be aware to maybe for certain instances on certain maps to not spam your Ash Blast off cooldown. Frontline is a great example of this. When you get to that bunker section of Frontline, if you use Ash Blast off cooldown, you're basically going to be permanently ashing those elites before they can even spawn out of those bunker holes. So generally speaking, use Ash Blast off on cooldown, but also keep in mind that you will be ashing certain enemies in spawn on certain maps. So that's going to be, you know, some kind of game knowledge you're going to accrue just by playing the game in general. Moving on to our third tips and tricks, we're going to be wanting to be using thermal bombs liberally on cooldown. Generally speaking, you want to be using thermal bombs on elites, such as alphas, cremators, and all those bosses. But it also has a great application just on regular groups of enemies if there's no elites around, right? You're debuffing yourself, you're debuffing your teammates, and it's on that 6.4 second cooldown. So just like with Ash Blast, if you see an elite, save that thermal bomb for an elite. But if you don't see any elites and you just see a group of ads, pop that thermal bomb. It has such a low cooldown, you're just going to get max value out of it in pretty much any scenario. Heading to our fourth tips and trick, it's going to be using Moaning Wind Swap liberally on priority targets and groups of ads that you're running by or you just failed to kill with your Funeral Comet, Shadow Comet, and Claymore Torrent, right? Make sure you don't discount Moaning Winds. Like for example, right, we hit some stuff with Shadow Comet, Claymore Torrent, they fail to die, just swap to your Moaning Winds, pop it, and then just, they're done. Go to the next section. You can also use Moaning Winds in like, you know, a scenario where you use your Shadow Comet, Claymore Torrent, but rather than standing still and just popping Moaning Winds, you can actually just, you know, run by a group of ads and just swap to your Moaning Winds and just pop them just like that as well. Which is going to be a great segue right now on the proper combo that we're going to be using for general purposes with this build. Heading to our 5th tips and trick, we're going to go ahead and show you guys a good combo you can use for general purposes with this build. Now, there's going to be more combos with skill usages and weapon mods that you're going to be able to figure out the more you play this build, depending on certain scenarios you run across on a certain map. But for general purposes, let's see how DEUCE handles this beginning part of Paxian. He's going to pop his Volcanic Rounds, and then when he sees a crawler here, he's going to go ahead and double thermal bomb him, use his Funeral Pyre with the Volcanic Round still active, go ahead and swap to his Radiation Splash and Moaning Winds on the Anemoi, taking advantage of the reload boost bonus now that he's weapon swapped, and then rinse and repeat basically that combo throughout the entire expedition. So any elites you see, pop that thermal bomb, and remember to always use your Funeral Pyre and swap back after Moaning Winds and Rad Splash to take advantage of that massive anomaly damage bonus you get when you're weapon swapping to take advantage of reload boost. This is going to be the general combo, but let's go ahead and take a look at another combo using Damage Link for bosses. Heading to our final tips and trick, we're going to showcase how broken Damage Link can be in certain scenarios and why it's pretty much like a cheat code in the game at times. If you want a full description on how Damage Link works, go ahead and look at the links down in the description below. It's going to showcase Dude with the Blunt's Devastator build where he goes into detail about Damage Link and its application. But for this build, when you're running into certain scenarios like this Moloch fight here, the best way to use Damage Link on your pistols with the String of Gauss and the Ultimate Damage Link application is going to be popping your Volcanic Rounds, popping your Ash Blast, double thermal bombs, spray the application of Damage Link between Moloch and both captains, go in there with the Moaning Winds, and if anything still survives, finish it off with the Funeral Pyre. Check it out, it's pretty fucking hot. Moloch who, by the way? And that's really how easy it is to use Damage Link in these certain scenarios. Dr. D is a great example, Moloch is a great example, the Pack Street Boys is a great example, or any situation on maps. Marshland Caverns comes to mind, where there's a whole bunch of elites in that beginning section with the Broodmothers. Surrounded by more elites and more ads is another great way to use Damage Link in this scenario. Very specific for certain scenarios, but when applied correctly like this, I mean, who doesn't want a one-shot Moloch, right? I mean, it's just super satisfying. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for making it to the end of this video. It turned out to be a lot longer than I imagined, but I really wanted to showcase the build and, you know, more or less go into that deep dive and pretty much end it almost like my Netflix episode of the Technomancer build in a sense. With that being said, as I've said that being said many times, go ahead and give me that like, comment, and subscribe, and check me out on my Twitch at twitch.tv/PlayDohBear, where I will be streaming every single day. And I'm going to go ahead and leave you guys with some solo and group gameplay of how this build performs. Be sure to check that out, and until the next time, have a great one. Peace.
that noise? It's like I've wandered into some maniac's idea of a party.